I'll be discussing some ideas and thoughts of the people down here, just discussing the status of fish in the Murray-Darling-Basin's South Australian section at the moment, and what we sort of think might be happening now and into the future. So if you've got any questions or queries or whatever, you can see me or any of the authors there. So, and as I said, it's focusing on that SA Murray-Darling region, but across the state there's issues with freshwater fish at the moment. So to start with, just a step back to the Millennium Drought. Most of you in the room will be aware of what occurred and how dire it got around the lower lakes. You can see some hydrographs, some graphs here that show the end of the drought during the critical water shortage period from 2007 to 2010. So it reduced water availability across the region and flow, and this resulted in a loss of habitat and connectivity across the region, drying of habitat for freshwater fish, loss of habitat as well, deterioration, and loss, and then the isolation of refuge populations of various species. And then put on top of that those environmental extremes, acid sulphate soils, hyper salinity, I guess, of the Coorong. It got really, really salty and impacted fish communities. So that's what happened. We all know that it ended. Well, things started to improve in terms of flow and water availability towards the end of 2010, early 2011. So it's not too long ago. But I guess I posed the question, are we ready for another drought-like period to occur? It seems only yesterday that the Millennium Drought finished. And we've done a fair bit of work to look at fish communities over that time and how they've responded. And I guess the scary thing, if you look at fish-related indicators, aside from any outlooks of flow and outlooks of rainfall across the basin and into South Australia, if you look at a number of indicators that were documented during the drought, so during that critical water shortage period, and then if you look for the Coorong, Lower Lakes, Eastern Mount Lofties, Golden Perch, further up the river, if you look if they are occurring already again, some 5 years after the Millennium Drought finished, if you look at assemblages of the Coorong are changing in a similar manner to what they did back then. Lower Lakes, in terms of freshwater specialists, changing. Golden Perch recruitment, or the lack of it, is already occurring. And across the Eastern Mount Lofties, there's declining numbers of fish, and the status of fish in various reaches of the region is already occurring again. There's a few differences that aren't, and I think Bryce will touch on them with diadromous species across the Coorong region and the like, and also to the extent in the lower lakes as well. So it's not a consistent pattern, but those signs are already there again. So the species most at risk are essentially those habitat specialists, so species that have specific habitat requirements across the environment. You can see in the map there, it shows the lower section of the Murray, lower lakes, and the Eastern Mount Lofty streams off to the left. Key habitat for these 5 species, the big 5 in terms of threatened fish, which is funny because apart from blackfish, they only grow about that size, so they're not actually that big, and that's perhaps part of their problem. So yeah, all have been monitored over recent years, and I guess stepping back also from that, when the drought was at its height, a number of programs were instigated essentially to rescue fish, aid recovery, and then having a restoration phase once the drought ended. And once it did, there was fish bred up, there was surrogate locations established, farm dams essentially, or in most cases. And from 2011, there was reintroductions undertaken for a range of species and accompanying monitoring and assessment to see how populations were going. We're talking 15,000 fish were reintroduced. And if you put that, I'll talk about it later at the end, but if you put that into perspective, so it was about 100,000 Murray cod have just been put in, essentially for recreational fishers in the Murray. So it's sort of the small numbers we're returning. And since 2014, those combined projects have sort of ceased, and there's been a various projects occurring looking at different aspects of the region and how fish communities are faring across the region. And there has been some reintroductions, what we're talking in the order of thousands, a few thousand fish over that time. So no one species probably shows how dire it did get during the drought and what's occurring now than Yarra pygmy perch, the little guy there. The important thing with these guys is there's only one, excuse me, Murray-Darling population occurs, and that's in the region. And also genetic work has shown that it's a different genetic unit to those that occur in the southeast of South Australia and into Victoria. So we're dealing with a population that needs to be managed in isolation, essentially. You can see some data from Scott down here that pretty well starts in spring 2007 and goes all the way through to March 2015, and that just shows the relative numbers of fish, Yarra pygmy perch, and you can see the blue bars stop in the summer of 2008. So despite monitoring across the region, there was no individuals detected for almost 4 years, indicating that probably did become regionally extinct. We can't rule out, obviously, that there was still some hanging on, and eDNA techniques like that might be useful to have a broad scan across the region, but essentially they disappeared. So fortunately, some fish were rescued before they did disappear, establishing a number of captive breeding programs and farm dams to safeguarding the species, essentially, and that enabled reintroductions to occur. So almost 6,000 fish to 5 former habitats over a couple of year period, and this has prompted short-term recovery of the species. You can see the little blip occurring there, and you can see the timing of the reintroductions as well. But it has been short-lived, that recovery. It was only probably 18 months that they were detected for, and then from autumn 2014, they were no longer found in the region. As I mentioned, those small-scale releases have occurred, most recently in spring 2015, and some follow-up monitoring by Scott Wedderburn has showed that they did hang on for a little while, but most recent sampling this autumn has shown that they're no longer around in the basin, I guess the basin as well, Lower Murray, the region, and the basin, as detected by our monitoring. So pretty dire situation. This is a nationally listed species as well. And the other part of that is the surrogate locations I have mentioned. Here's one near Mount Compass. Small number of fish were put in, and the population boomed. We were regularly getting 5,000 fish out of that dam, or there was at least 5,000 fish in the dam. Good aquatic vegetation, no other predators in there, which is a big thing. This is during the heydays, and then fast forward to the last couple of summers, and that's what it looks like now. So it's down to about 0.8 of a metre. That's deliberately an empty net there, because there's no more fish. The population's collapsed, so we've got, we were always saying, we've got this dam with lots of fish, but there wasn't any funding at that stage to do reintroductions. We got funding back to do reintroductions, but unfortunately the fish weren't there. There are some other locations, but I guess it shows that this was probably the best population in the Murray-Darling-Basin was in this one dam, and ironically was out of the basin, just out of the basin. So they're really critical, these surrogate locations, and the reality is we sort of need them to make sure we can let species like Yarra pygmy perch survive, and so that's quite an issue with that species. So I guess that poses another question. Are we happy to accept the loss of, in this case, Yarra pygmy perch from the region? And not wanting to sound too dire, it is probably the reality for that species. And there's other species similarly affected. Purple spotted gudgeon, there's only one known population in South Australia, in the South Australian Murray-Darling section, and it's hanging on through reintroductions as well. And hopefully you all say no to that question. And if you do, then we need to know who's responsible, who is ultimately responsible. There's a number of agencies and researchers looking at what's going on with fish and managing them, but we need a coordinated, decisive management, coordinated actions really, with a whole bunch of stakeholders who learnt lessons from that drought period, and essentially a plan of attack we know how things are changing, how they change during the drought. We can almost step it out and have thresholds for when certain actions are undertaken. Paramount to this is obviously monitoring and assessment, tracking how these species are going through time. And an important aspect too is identifying refuge populations and habitats that will be easy to manage and maintain during periods of further dry. If we know where they are and they can be proactively managed, then that is a seed source for when the water returns. And as I've said a number of times, the surrogate locations too are critical to the survival of these species. The longer term perspective, so a whole range of broader, higher level water reform and restoring habitat, connectivity, all those kind of issues. But the one thing I sort of want to emphasise here is the scale of production for small-bodied fish. So, as I said, 100,000 odd Murray cod. Trout cod in the mid-Murray and lower Ovens, it was about 280,000 fish over a 10-year period were reintroduced. We're dealing with, across 4 species, 15,000, 16,000 fish over a 2-3 year period. So, and we're dealing with the lower lakes, a massive, expansive area. It's probably unrealistic to assume that they're going to establish and self-sustaining populations are going to result. So I think the scale of production and captive breeding needs to be really ramped up if that's the way we're going to go about these kind of things. And obviously those broader issues will improve the habitat, but I think it is realistic we do need this kind of production. So just to conclude, we really need to learn from the past. The recent Millennium Drought is not too far long ago. People should remember what happened and the actions that were required for freshwater fish, threatened freshwater fish. And I guess the main thing to learn is actions are needed before the shit hits the fan, really. We need them now, really, so we can have a plan of attack. Doesn't necessarily mean too many actions need to occur now, but needs to be a logical plan. And in order to achieve this, strong leadership and governance of threatened freshwater fish in the state is needed, and obviously collaboration is also critical for this to occur. Any questions? If they're hard, you can talk to the other people. Do we have time for questions?
We actually have time for this one. Are there any questions?
Yes.
What role does PERSA have in this place in terms of restoration of listed threatened species given
They assist with permits and the like and all that sort of stuff. That's, yeah, I guess there's obviously threatened species, and also PERSA are probably the lead agencies that should be sort of taking the active role in managing this. Obviously researchers and other managers, local managers have a say in it, but yeah, perhaps it is because they are, as you say, they are protected, a lot of these species, so perhaps that's where it should come down from. Yes?
What do you think the biggest driver of second
It's probably, if you looked at the numbers there, we're dealing with a heavily restricted population as it is, and a Millennium Drought implies something that is pretty severe and doesn't happen that often. So maybe if we all walked away and left it without any human intervention, maybe they would recover over a long time frame. But we're just dealing with such a severe event and such a small population. So that second drop could be related to redfin boomed around that time in the lower lakes, and also, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the numbers released were really small, so perhaps that wasn't enough to make the populations more sustainable.
Right, we'll have to stop there.
All right.
Thank you. Next is Irene Wagner from Department of